Sure. Yeah. Cool. Let me share my slides with you guys. Okay. All right. Cool. Oh, this is still loading. Okay, perfect. So first, I just want to thank everybody for coming to my presentation. And this is a presentation about the study that I performed this semester, which is titled The Intersystem Consistency of Object-Based Surround Sound. And basically, in my study, I was comparing object-based surround sound and channel-based surround sound in two different speaker configurations. So before I kind of get into what that study looked like and stuff like that, let's first just discuss kind of what surround sound is and what channel-based and object-based is. So I think we're all kind of familiar with surround
Erin,
sound.
can I just interject 1 second? Because
Yes.
we have an interpreter for Ladasha.
Oh, do I need to talk a little slower?
I think you started really quickly. I don't know about the interpreter, but if I'd been interpreting it, it would have been difficult.
Okay, I'll slow down a little bit. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're all familiar with surround sound in some sense. We've probably all been to a cinema before. It's really common for IMAX cinemas, for Dolby Cinema, but just cinemas in general all have surround sound. And surround sound was first introduced in its channel-based form in the 1950s. So it's been around for a very long time. And it operates with these things called audio beds. So on the right side of my slide here, you can see I have two images. The first one at the top is showing that there's panning information involved. So for stereo sound, you have two channels, your left and your right. I think everyone's pretty familiar with this. You have it on your computer, you have it in your TV, etc. And with that, you have kind of just the option of going from the left to the right. And as you go into surround sound, you start to get more axes of panning. So you start to get front and back when you add speakers behind you, and you start to get top to bottom when you add height channels. And the main kind of concern with channel-based surround, even though it's been around for so long, is if you change the speaker configuration at all, or you change how you're placing the speakers, it vastly changes how the audio travels about the space. So if you look at my bottom right image here, I'm kind of showing you just with stereo, but you can see when I have my left and right, and I have my audio coming out, it's coming straight out towards the listener. But if I angle those speakers in, now the audio trajectory is completely different. I have the left channel crossing all the way over to the right and the right channel crossing over to the left. So this has been a big issue to the point where there's this union called the International Telecommunications Union, which sets standards for how speaker configurations should look to kind of address this issue where if speakers are placed in different locations, the audio is going to sound different than anticipated. So this is something that people have been dealing with for years. They kind of have to anticipate how the people who are going to be listening to their audio are actually going to be able to hear it. So there's a bunch of different speaker configurations. There's 5.1, there's 7.1, there's 7.1.4, and they all have very specific standards for how those speaker configurations should look. So this has just been something mixing engineers have had to deal with since the 50s. But in 2012, Dolby Laboratories released the first version of object-based surround. And the big difference with object-based is it still uses these audio beds sometimes, but it also introduced something called an audio object. So if you look in the bottom corner here on the left, I have an example of showing how an audio object would react when it's placed in a different room with a different speaker configuration. The main difference with audio objects is instead of just having panning information hard-coded, it just has the trajectory hard-coded. So if I have my blue arrow in the left side of this image here, and I say I want it to travel this way across the room, I save that information and then I bring it to a middleman called a renderer. The renderer then takes that information, it knows how the audio is supposed to travel, and it also knows what the room looks like and what speakers I have available. And based on that information, it can remix the audio to try to keep the same trajectory. So this was a brand new kind of concept, and it erased a lot of the issues that came with channel-based surround. So the main point of my study is to evaluate if this claim of being able to keep audio trajectories in the correct place is accurate. So that's just kind of a lead-in of what channel-based and object-based surround look like and the differences between them. So now we'll get into the actual study structure. I had 3 surveys that I gave to people. The first one was just demographics, kind of getting age ranges, level of experience, stuff like that. And the next 2 were about how people localized sound in the space around them and how people felt about the sound or their impression of it. So I'll get a little bit more into what that means. For localization, that's just your ability to follow the path of audio. So for example, if you're watching TV and there's a helicopter flying across the screen, pardon me, you might be able to follow that path of the audio across the screen. So I was just making sure that as I changed the speaker configuration, people were still able to follow that path of audio accurately. And the next thing was just the overall quality of the audio. So just how people perceived it, how good it sounded, how enveloping it was, things like that. And I'll get a little bit more into that when I get to that part of the study. But since I'm comparing two different speaker configurations, let's talk about what those configurations looked like. So on the right side here, I have two different configurations shown. On the left side, this is the correct 7.1 channel configuration. So I say correct with quotations because it's correct given the ITU standards, which is the union I mentioned earlier. And this is kind of the standard that people have been following for years of how they should set up 7.1 surround. So I was comparing this expected 7.1 configuration to an unexpected configuration, where I was taking the speakers that are behind you, usually at about ear level, and I moved them up about 1 meter. So this is a expected placement for speakers to be in general, but not for 7.1. And this is kind of simulating a situation where you don't have room to put the speakers directly behind you, so you have to elevate them. So those were the two different speaker configurations I used in my study. And on the right side here, you can also see there's an image of the room that I ran the study in. This is on RIT's campus. It's in the ENT building, and it's fully 22.2 surround capable. But again, I just used 7.1 for this study. Cool. So I discussed the two different speaker configurations, but all in all, there's 5 different types of audio samples that I used because I was comparing channel-based with the correct and the wrong, and object-based with the correct and the wrong. So the 5th sample was actually a baseline sample. I included it to be vastly different from the other 4 just to evaluate if people were actually listening critically and if they listened to the baseline sample that was mixed completely differently than the other 4 and they kind of perceived it the same way, then I would know that that person wasn't really listening carefully, and I would kind of have to think about whether or not to use that data point. So it was kind of just used to make sure that people were really paying attention when they were taking my study, because I knew that the differences between the different configurations were going to be pretty minute. So I wanted to make sure that people were really, putting their all into it and paying attention. So for the first test, for localization, I did a circular type trajectory about the room for all of the samples except for the baseline, where I did a different trajectory, again, to make sure that people were really paying attention to the path of the audio. And I also asked people how clear the path was and also how precise it was. And they had to draw out how they perceived the audio path. So you can see over on the right side here what the actual trajectories were, and then also how people perceived them, generally speaking. So this is just all the participants with their drawings laid over each other. And as you can see, most people did understand that the trajectory was circular. So that was good to see. And unfortunately, these images, the differences between them were so minute, I ended up not being able to use the images as much, but I still thought it was interesting to see how people were perceiving the sound. For the impression test, they were all made up of the same audio content. Again, there was 5 samples, and I asked people their level of envelopment, level of satisfaction, and level of timbral fidelity. So let me explain what those terms kind of mean. So for envelopment, it just refers to how surrounded you feel by the music. So for example, a 10 for envelopment would mean that you felt there was sound coming at you from all directions. It felt really evenly dispersed. You felt fully enveloped by it, right? But it would be lower on the envelopment scale if, for example, you felt like there was a big gap on the left side, you weren't getting a lot of sound there, you would give it a lower level for envelopment. Level of satisfaction was just referring to just overall how people liked the music. I wanted to see if people liked different configurations better than other ones and stuff like that. And finally, timbre fidelity refers to how well balanced the mix was overall. So basically, if they felt there was a good amount of mid, lows, and high frequencies inside the mix, a lower amount of timbre fidelity would be if you were listening to the music and you felt like the bass was way too loud and it was kind of drowning out the other instruments, that would be lower for timbre fidelity. So those were the 3 categories I asked people about for impression. And on the right here, I'm just kind of showing you another way that I made sure my samples were consistent. and I was getting the best data possible was I made sure they all played back at the same general loudness level. And basically it just means that their volume was the same. The reason for this is sometimes people can perceive music that is louder as implicitly better, which isn't necessarily true, but it's just the way that people perceive it. So I wanted to make sure that they were playing back at the same volume. Okay, so let's get into the results, right? So first of all, for channel-based, I actually found that between the correct and wrong speaker configuration, there were no significant changes. I determined this using two-tailed paired t-test to determine the significance. And on the left here, what's actually being graphed is the means of each perception that people had for channel-based correct and channel-based wrong. So as you can see, people weren't perceiving a lot of differences for channel-based. The biggest kind of change you can see on the graph is with timbre fidelity, but again, this was not a statistically significant change. But for object-based, there was a significant change for envelopment only. So I put an asterisk next to that on the graph, but you can also see when you're looking at it that there is a pretty big difference with timbre fidelity and satisfaction, although these are not technically statistically significant. So just looking at these two graphs, it doesn't look great for object-based, right? It's a little crazy. I wasn't expecting it, but if you look at the actual effect size of this significant change for envelopment, the effect size has a Conan D value of 0.2, which actually indicates that it's a pretty small effect. So despite the fact that the means look vastly different for object-based, only one of them was significantly different. And also, even though it was significantly different, it wasn't a very big change in the mean. But I also just wanted to show you guys what it looks like in compared to the baseline sample. So this is just showing the channel with the correct configuration, the object with the correct configuration versus my baseline sample that was mixed very differently. And you can see immediately that people perceived that sample a lot differently for 3 of the 5 attributes that I asked people about. So this was good to see that people were perceiving it differently generally. And you can see that it performed a lot worse than both different surround sound technologies for timbre fidelity, clarity, and satisfaction. I think the reason why it didn't perform a lot worse for precision and envelopment was my own fault. I think I could have made the baseline sample a little bit better to make sure it was generally worse for all 5 of the attributes. But I think seeing channel-based and object-based compared against the bad mix kind of shows like that the changes between channel-based and object-based really weren't that significant when compared to something that was mixed differently. But yeah, the basic summarization of my study's results is that object-based surround was not better than channel-based surround at perceiving localization and impression for these specific speaker configurations. However, I will kind of add a stipulation that further research is definitely required to confirm this finding. At a pretty small sample size of only 27 people, and I only tested 2 specific speaker configurations. I think going forward, a good step would be to, first of all, collect more data points overall, but also to test this with different speaker configurations and also test it in different actual spaces. Because another part of this is that, you know, the system was changing, but it was still in the same space, and changes in your surroundings can also have a really big effect on acoustics. So I definitely think that this was an interesting finding to start, but there's a lot more research required. And I'm ready to take questions now if anybody has them.
So Erin, let me begin. I have a specific question about how you set the study up, but first of all, let me ask you, so what is your discipline background that caused you to decide on this project?
Yeah, sure. So I'm doing a double major with SOIS and also the electrical engineering technology department. So through that, I've taken a lot of audio courses with Dr. Sung-Young Kim. And he was my capstone advisor for this, and I was using his audio lab. But another part of this is that I have worked for Dolby previously, and I'm actually going to be returning there this summer. So their technology is something that's very interesting to me, and I wanted to really evaluate it.
So since you said that Dolby was the company that introduced the object-based, presumably they would like you to find results that say it's better than the other kind.
Sure. But I think another part of it is that, you know, I think it's good to have people who are like outside of the company evaluating these claims and making
skeptical,
sure that what they're saying is true. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, you've already said, presumably the actual space that you're doing the testing in matters, and you've got the different configurations that you could imagine. But also what you didn't mention is you didn't say that you actually had some sort of measure for the subject's hearing acuity. I mean, everybody has different, hearing loss
Right.
to some extent or other, depending on age, certainly. But so why did you not do that?
So
Because
actually
wouldn't that matter?
I'm sorry, were you continuing?
I said, wouldn't that matter?
Yes, it actually, I agree with you. It would matter. In my demographic survey, something I asked about was if people had any amount of hearing impairment or hearing loss. And I also asked people their level of experience with surround sound in general, and also just with audio mixing.
I see.
So it is something that I accounted for in my research.
But if you were going to do this, professionally, presumably you'd want some more accurate measure of the hearing status of your subjects, right? I mean,
Sure. I think specifically for this study, it was more about users' perception of audio and less about objectively what was correct. So it's more about how people were perceiving the sound around them. So really what was more of an effect was people's experience level. And that's not something I can very accurately decide. I have to ask them what they think their experience level is. But definitely hearing loss is something that I was concerned about when doing this.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Great research study. And I'm going to hand it over to Meg. Meg, do you have any questions?
I do. All right. Bennett, first, a couple comments. So I thought that was really interesting. I'm curious how you came up with the idea for drawing the perceived sound, because I thought that was really interesting, how you overlaid how each person must have drawn it out. So what made you think about that is one question.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one is, I really like how you accounted for the consistency in your research and ensuring that you were, providing really consistent sound so that you could get really consistent results. And is that something that you came up with, or is that something that was part of the training that you went through for research with human subjects?
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, those are great questions. So the first question was about, why I decided to have people draw the paths. And the reason for that was when I was deciding, how I wanted to design my study, I was looking into a lot of existing studies into object-based surround. And well, first of all, I decided to, do a study where I was just changing the placement of the speakers rather than doing up mixing or down mixing, which is when you add speakers or remove them. Because I noticed there was a lot of studies based around up mixing and down mixing, but not as many evaluating object-based surround's other claim of being able to anticipate when speakers are moving placement. So that was why I chose to do that. And alongside that, when I was looking into studies, I found one study in particular, I can't remember who ran it at this moment, but she was looking at how people perceived audio systems in cars. And what she had people do was draw where they thought the sound was coming from and kind of where they thought instruments were coming from in the car. And I found that to be a really interesting way of being able to mark down people's perception of the space. So I wanted to try it out. And unfortunately for me, I think just because the trajectories I was doing were so simple, it wasn't as helpful, but it was still interesting to see, how people were generally kind of perceiving the space around them and stuff like that. So that's where I got the idea from.
Okay, great.
And the second question was about consistency, right? So yeah, with that one, honestly, I started setting up my samples and maybe like 2 weeks before I ran the study, all of a sudden I was like, oh, I need to put like things into place to make sure I'm getting as consistent results as possible. Because I wanted to make sure that if I was going to be collecting data, that it was good data. So I kind of talked to my Capstone advisor about it and also was looking through some of my textbooks to make sure that anything that could cause people to perceive the samples differently was accounted for, and that I was really making sure that the only differences were those speakers being changed.
Okay, great answers. And then my last question is, so I can envision the value in this kind of research, but what's the specific application for this?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I think most generally speaking, it's just evaluating those claims. But the reason why I chose the specific speaker configurations that I chose was that I could imagine that this is a situation that people could run into when trying to set up 7.1 surround, because it's just very inconvenient to have speakers placed behind you at a 130-degree angle. People tend to move them either all the way to the sides or up, because it's a lot easier to mount speakers kind of in the top corner of your room than to just have them set up on a stand at ear level behind you. So it's a pretty common issue that people, when they set up surround systems in their home or like maybe in their home studio, that they have to end up changing those rear surround speakers to be higher up than anticipated. So I wanted to test kind of how the two different technologies held up in that situation.
Okay, great, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions from anybody else? We've got a rather large audience, which is nice.
Okay, hearing none, we are actually only 2 minutes over, so good job, Erin. And now we're going to move on to Angie. So if you're ready to share your screen, Angie, take it away.
Yes, okay. Can you all see that?
I can.
Great. Okay, so my study is called a comparative visitor study of 3 zoos. And I just wanted to add a disclaimer. I haven't yet studied the 3rd zoo. So right now it's just a comparative visitor study of 2 zoos. So for my research questions, I wanted to find out what people were interested in at zoos. My interest in this was piqued by an internship that I did through RIT at the Seneca Park Zoo as a zookeeper. And I also have a background in journalism and museum studies. So I wanted to see how zoos, which are kind of a unique form of living museum, can inform the public about environmental topics and things like that. So I wanted to be able to compare different styles of exhibit and different elements in these exhibits to see which are the most effective for people's interests. And in my background research for this, I found that the species of animal that is in the exhibit has a great deal more effect on how long people stay in the exhibit than the exhibit itself. So for example, if it was a panda bear exhibit versus a snake exhibit, people want to see the cuddly pandas and not the snake. So that's why I wanted to do separate zoos instead of inside one zoo, which is a study that's been done many times, is comparing different exhibits within one. And then this would compare the same exhibit, but across the different zoos. So why is this important? The Association of Zoos and Aquariums requires a certain level of conservation education in their accreditation process. And so that's the same with the European Association for Zoos and Aquariums. So I wanted to see how these zoos are meeting that requirement. And this is also important information for the zoos. So this study would be good for if a zoo was interested in how they're comparing to other zoos and what are the better strategies that other zoos are employing that maybe they don't have time to research themselves that I could do. So for this study, it was just an observational study. So I observed visitors as they entered the space, and I timed how long they spent at each element of the exhibit. And then I timed their total time in the space. So on the right here, you can see an example of the raw data that I collected. So this would be the panda exhibit at the Berlin Zoo. And I collected their foot pattern of where they were headed in which direction. And then I collected how much time they spent at each location in the exhibit. And each of those locations corresponds to an element that I was studying. So this allowed me to understand the foot pattern flow and how that affects the interest in elements as well. So the 3 exhibits that I studied were pandas, tigers, and aviary bird exhibits. So here you can see the Berlin and Madrid panda exhibits. In the Berlin panda exhibit, you can see that there is an outdoor area. There is also an indoor area for a total of 4 viewing areas. In Madrid, there's 3, 2 outdoor and 1 indoor. And the Madrid indoor area is inside a closed sort of room that you walk through. And it's a relatively small room, so I had to observe from outside of the room. But in Berlin, I was able to observe each element of the exhibit separately. So here you can see that at the Berlin Zoo, the average amount of time spent observing the pandas only is about 1.5 minutes longer than the average amount of time spent observing the pandas in Madrid. Some differences are that the Berlin Zoo had 12 elements, including a TV that was showing the process of the baby pandas being born, and a bunch of different literatures that you could read and interactive elements. So this time is specifically just watching the animals, but you can see that they spend longer watching the animals when there's more information to supplement that, even though that the time spent watching the information is not accounted for in that time. And then you can see on the right, the most interesting element for people, almost 50% of visitors viewed the TV screen, which is showing baby pandas. So it's kind of self-explanatory why that was the most interesting, but it also didn't involve any words. So that meant that people who didn't have a good understanding of German or English could understand that better than they could understand the written text and labels. The second highest and the only other statistically significantly higher element was a timeline showing the panda growth over time. So from baby to adult. Again, that's tapping into the baby panda intrigue, and it was situated between 2 of the viewing areas. So when people were crossing from one viewing area to the other, it was easy for them to just read the timeline as they walked across. So this is something that I found across many of the exhibits. Placement of the element is the most important part when it comes to if people are going to read it or interact with it, and not the content of the element itself. Huh. So in the tiger exhibits, in the Berlin Zoo, it was a completely indoor exhibit. And an interesting fact about this is that the footpath for this exhibit takes you down a set of stairs. And once you are down the set of stairs, you've completely missed all of the labels and interactive elements. So people head straight down towards the tigers and they pretty much skip all of those, and they come up on the other side having skipped the whole part. Then in Madrid, their exhibit is a little bit more industrial looking. It has a lot of concrete, and they only have 1 label for the tiger, and it's inside the exhibit past the bars. So the bars are kind of obscuring it. So, but you can see that even though there are big differences in the exhibit, the time spent at observing the tigers in both Berlin and Madrid is almost equivalent. So this doesn't support the hypothesis that the more information that is provided will increase people's time spent observing the animal. However, the fact that this information was less accessible could explain this difference. Then on the right, you can see the different elements that are inside the tiger area, including 2 other animals, the Goodfellows tree kangaroo and African ants. So these, the times or the amount of people at each of these exhibits corresponds to previous studies, which is that people are more interested in the animals than anything else. And the bigger and fluffier the animal, the more time that they will spend looking at them. So the tiger is the biggest, and then, you know, the ants are less interesting, of course. And then finally, the aviaries. In Berlin, the aviary is a big house that is separated into rooms based on the continent that the birds come from. And you go on a kind of a round tour of this building, going through each room. So the foot patterns in this area are very similar to each, very consistent. People are taking about the same path for each. In the Berlin aviary, there are small labels for each individual species of bird, and then a few large panels in each room that are describing the general habitat or some interesting facts about birds in that continent. And in a couple of the rooms, there are interactive TV screens that you can go up and touch and do a little interactive virtual learning experience. So I studied one of those rooms that had the TV and the labels. And then in Madrid, it's a much smaller area where all the birds are sharing a space, and they can come up to you because there's no cage. And there are fewer viewing areas, and as well as the labels are on this picture on the opposite side of that. So you have to completely turn yourself 180 to read the labels for those birds. So for this reason, the time spent observing birds in the Madrid Zoo is almost 2.5 minutes less on average than the time spent in the Berlin Zoo observing these birds. However, of the subjects that I observed, none interacted with the interactive TV, and very few read the labels. But there is in this room specifically a place where you can go and measure yourself against the wall, against the height of birds that are like ostriches that are around your height. And almost 50% of visitors did this activity. So that led me to believe that maybe it's elements that are relatable to you specifically. If you can measure, oh, hey, what do I look like in comparison to this bird? So it's possible that making things more accessible to people on an individual level is something that will increase their interest and time spent in the exhibit. And here you can see that's the measurement element that people could do. So the big takeaways from the study that I found is that most people don't read anything at the zoo. They go there to look at the animals. They're not spending time reading the labels. But if there are lots of labels and it's almost unavoidable to read one, something catches your eye somewhere and you want to read it, this increases your association with the animals. It increases your knowledge about the animals, so you're more likely to spend more time watching them. The major factor for what people stop at and read or interact with is the placement. It can't be before the animal because people will walk right past it in order to watch the animal. And it has to be somewhere that their natural foot pattern is going to take them towards, because they're not going to want to walk away from that natural path. In general, interest in the animal increases when the information is easily accessible. So easily accessible is easy to read, or it does not require reading. It is relatable to you, and as with the interactive TVs, it's not something that you have to kind of click through to find. It's right there for you to see and read pretty easily and without problems. So yes, in general, these are the things that I learned, and hopefully I will be able to continue this study in another zoo. However, time in the semester is running out. But I think it's if I could do this study again, I would want to do it and conduct individual interviews with visitors so that I can get their personal takes on how they're feeling, because right now I'm just making assumptions based on the observational data that I'm in. So, yes.
Thanks,
Any
Angie.
questions? Thank you.
Yes, is this the first observational study you've done?
It is, yes.
Okay, so like any scientific research, there are the potential variables in most cases are huge. So you have to constrain them as much as possible in order to get any sort of, I mean, the same might be said of Erin's research, right? There are many variables and you just can't take account of all of them. But I think as you do more and more of this sort of research, you get the hang of that and you begin to see how you can try and exclude the variables that you don't want to be messing with your data. In any case, I wonder, well, first of all, did anybody at either of these two zoos have any interest in what you were doing? I mean, did you communicate with the zoos? How did that go?
People working at the zoos or visitors?
Yeah. Did they know who you were and what you were doing? Were they interested?
Yes. Yeah. So with both zoos, I was able to meet with members of the staff and explain my study and get permission to conduct it, first of all. But at both zoos, they were very interested in seeing the results and the comparisons as well. So this is something that zoos are definitely interested in learning about.
So when you write this up, are you going to share? You're going to share your research with both zoos?
Yes, I hope to. Yes.
Yeah. So one possible conclusion, which is sort of it's a silly conclusion, but you might conclude from the data that you showed that people in Berlin are more interested in spending more time with animals than people in Madrid.
It's possible. Of course, there's so many factors.
Right, exactly. So that goes to the number of variables that you have to try and control for. Absolutely fascinating study. I really enjoyed listening to your description of it. I'm not surprised you picked pandas. I mean, you can't lose with pandas, right?
Of course.
Where is the third zoo again? Did you say Denmark? Where?
Yes, Copenhagen.
Okay. Copenhagen, right? Are you still going there?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you get the opportunity, I mean, you know, it's sort of artificial. The semester goes for 15 weeks and then it's done. I mean, but I really hope that you continue to, even when, you know, when the semester's done, if you find yourself in Copenhagen Zoo, that you continue to do this.
Yes, I would love to.
Very interested. Very interesting. Okay, Meg?
Thanks, Stephen. So I thought that was really interesting too, Angie.
Thank you.
Can you share with me just a little bit of your background and whether or not you ever had the opportunity to do like Dr. Julie Decker's visitor engagement course that does a little bit about museums and zoos and aquaria?
Yes, so I've never taken that course specifically, but I've taken a couple courses with Dr. Decker, and she was my main research advisor for this study. So she helped me out with learning these strategies for taking this data. So yes, my background is in journalism, environmental science, and museum studies. So I thought this was a good combination of the three.
Yeah, absolutely. So especially with the environmental science interest, disciplinary interest, can you imagine a scenario where you're also incorporating a level of engagement in the zoo and how that would potentially affect conservation actions by individuals that visit zoos?
Yes, yeah. I in my preliminary research, I saw a couple studies that are sort of along those lines, seeing how a visit to the zoo would affect actions later on. So I would love to do something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting, especially knowing, so I work with, we have a partnership with the Seneca Park Zoo Society, which is basically the organization that runs the zoo, but Monroe County is the one that works with the animals. A much smaller zoo than any of the three probably that you are visiting. But I know that they in particular have an interest in the visitor engagement because one, like you said, it's a requirement of their organization and their licensure, but also they're very interested in impacting conservation efforts moving forward. So that would be a really interesting component. Did you research zoos? I mean, you're limited obviously by where you're traveling, although obviously you're making the rounds, but were you limited did you do some research to ensure that you're looking at zoos that have maybe a comparable size or a similar amount of engagement by the public?
Yeah, so obviously I'm limited by the places that I can travel to. So I thought that these zoos were good comparisons because they're all in, you know, world capitals that are internationally visited. So I thought that that was good. A good mix of visitors will be at each zoo instead of a local zoo like Seneca Park, which is not getting very many international visitors. So that was the main source of similarities between the three zoos, I would say.
Right, and obviously
they're
pretty
also
big ticket
all three.
items. Yeah.
Sorry, what's
Sorry.
that?
I was just saying you also are looking at least 2 out of 3 pretty big ticket items for a zoo to have a panda and a tiger. So that by itself it creates the parallel between the 3.
Right, of course.
Great. Well, really nice job. So I'll open it up since we do have a nice size audience. If there's anybody else that wants to ask any questions.
Let me come on again, Angie, and say, so you picked animals that are sort of dramatic animals. They have, you know, everybody's interested in tigers and pandas, perhaps not so much birds, but birds too. But you mentioned the ants, and nobody was spending much time with the ants. So it might be interesting to look at compare visitor engagement with animals or creatures that are not so sexy as pandas and tigers. I mean, I think that would be interesting too. So, I mean, there's any number of studies that you could do, I guess, coming out of this theme. Yeah. Well,
yeah,
great.
I would love to see if people read more when the animal is less cute, you know?
Yeah.
Like if I'm with the panda exhibit, I want to see the pandas, but if I'm at the snake exhibit, maybe the snake is just curled up in a corner sleeping, maybe then I'll read the text about the snake. So yeah, something interesting to research maybe later.
You should definitely tell the German authorities, the zoo authorities, that they move the placards, the information points on the tiger exhibit to some place where I can imagine where they're going down the stairs, and of course you're not. I don't know where.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a kind of a silly place, but anyway, it's a great study. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Ladasha.
All right, can everyone see?
Yep.
Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Ladasha Williams. My project is titled Stickers for an Academic Planner. So what are academic stickers? Sorry about that, skipped ahead a little bit. So academic stickers have many different uses related to school. You know, for example, homework, tests, projects, there are many different uses. Academic stickers also help students with organization for their planners, as well as students are able to write on the stickers themselves and then put them in their planners. So the purpose of my project specifically, so for my project, I wanted to get creative. And so I created and made stickers related to academics. I also wanted to help students keep organized and encourage that planner usage. So the reason why I chose this project is I have a lot of experience just looking for the perfect kind of planner stickers, exactly what I want, something related to school. Also, in general, the sticker selection is very limited. There are not a ton of choices, especially not for academic stickers. And then also boring colors. So I gave a survey to a small group of peers. Number one, I asked them, what kind of academic stickers would you use for academic planning? Most people responded that they would use them for homework, specific assignments, quizzes, tests, projects, reading due dates, and studying. And then secondly, I had different shapes and layouts for the stickers. And I asked in the survey, about the stickers. Would they prefer square, that kind of layout? I asked, you prefer a vertical layout, a bulleted layout with bullet points included with lines or without, maybe times included, for example, due or deadline, those kind of hot button words, words like homework, project, tests, on that layout. I asked about rectangle layouts, different motivational quotes, and different things like that. So squares and rectangle layouts, they had a similar statistic here. They had similar data. But as for ribbons, that layout, I did ask a different question about the different shapes that people would prefer. And then here's again more about the ribbons. So for number 7, I did ask if there was any other type of sticker shapes that they would love to see. And most of them responded star shapes, fun, different shapes, or heart shapes. And then for number 8 on the survey, I asked them which colors they would like to see, black and white or neutral tones, like neutral aesthetic colors, or just full, vibrant, colorful colors. So I narrowed down this data for my design for these stickers. And I ended up with 3 categories. The most popular, average popularity, and low popularity. And I used these questions from the survey to categorize these 3 groups of stickers. And I decided to choose most popular as well as the average popularity group, and ignored the low popularity group of answers. So I narrowed it down to those 2. Then I started jotting down and brainstorming some ideas, examples for colors of font, different decorations, simple colors, the individual shapes, decor even on the font. And then once I considered all those things, I used Canva, this website and this program, I used that to design all of these things. So I went on Canva to do that. So here are the rectangle and the bullets. And then on the right here, we have the circle layout. You know, just some simple colors with very decorative font. And you'll notice that the colors are, you know, white and black. I wanted to make sure that the color contrast was good enough that you were able to see everything. And then here is the triangle. Very simple color, with the decorative font, excuse me. Then we have the square. And then the bulleted ones with the lines. You know, students with these could write, you know, assignments, to-do lists. They can write anything and be able to check those off. Then I also included here different sizes and, you know, larger squares with cute little decorations on those as well. I have a different size here. I made them a little bit smaller, the square ones. And then over to the right, these were just ideas for just little motivational quotes, things to include. So I chose this word for the motivational stickers, just, you know, to encourage students to keep going. You know, maybe it's the end of an assignment or the end of a project, you know, just to push and encourage that positive thinking and keep people motivated. Also with the stars, I did that layout with the different colors. Also wanted to make sure, you know, what I did matched what the survey data had collected for as far as which stickers I made and which stickers that I plan to make. So how I went about making these stickers is shown here. So what I just showed everyone was a digital Canva rendering of what I planned to print. So what I did is I had to download a special design software, Cricut, which is pictured here. You know, my research is titled Academic Stickers. So I wanted to, you know, kind of create a brand from this. You know, the different shapes, the different layouts. Those all became attachments. I checked the size to make sure those were all right. And then before printing, I had to do all of those things. Then third, once I start the printing process, now the papers are not normal papers. These are special sticker papers that are used in this machine. Now here in number 4, you can see that these papers are laid on that sticky blue mat that's pictured here. So you lay that paper on that sticky mat and then it will go through that machine, the Cricut machine. Then moving on to that next picture, the machine will then cut and make those indications on the sheet. Then the 6th picture there, once it is finished making those cutting indications, then the person doing that has to carefully peel that off the mat. There were a few times that I almost, you know, tore the paper or went through the paper, and those accidents very easily happen. Then number 7 here, we see the result. layouts. So what did I learn from this project? Measurements are hard. Everything to do with measuring, making sure that everything is the correct size and not too big, not too small, in proportion, and making sure that everything is standard and the right size for a planner and standard for standard planners. It's also tough to make these shapes and figure out the layouts for and margins or even spaces. For example, the circular stickers, the other circles, they have to be far enough apart, but you also want to make sure that they are aligned horizontally. Those have to be perfectly aligned. For example, I showed you those digital renderings of the layouts, and those were hard to, make sure that they were perfect both horizontally and vertically in that grid. I also learned about the Cricut machine and that software. I learned if I chose a low or default, there wasn't a lot of pressure added for the cutting for those indications. So I learned, the different amounts of pressure that needed to be applied to cut the specific stickers and papers. That was a learning curve. I also learned that the machine itself, when it is so the sensor needs to be dark. The cut sensor marks need to be dark. That's very important for the Cricut machine. Now, the reason for that, so in the beginning, I thought that this, bright light and colors, and I was completely wrong. The machine doesn't recognize it and won't cut around that if there is that bright light of colors. So things need to be dark so that the machine is able to recognize and indicate where it needs to cut. So that was an interesting thing to learn.
Can I interrupt, Ladasha? You've got 1 more minute.
Okay. So the lastly here, transparency as far as background. You want the machine and the sensor marks to be able to detect those and cut appropriately on that paper. If there are none, it will not cut appropriately. And now I will open up for questions.
Okay, let me begin by asking Ladasha, you made it clear that this is something that you think would be useful in your own academic life. But how does it connect to what you've been studying in your undergraduate degree? What have your concentrations been?
So that's a good question. So sorry, we're just clarifying here.
Sure.
So my major here would be entrepreneurial business. So, I've thought a lot. I've wanted to sell academic planner stickers, to help other students, have things to put in their planners. And so I would say that's how it lines up.
Okay, so, you know, in order to be quite sure that you're going in the right direction, I think you need more respondents to your survey, because you only had 6. So if you continue to develop this idea, which I think is a very good idea, I think you probably need to get more feedback from your potential customers. That's just on the side, just a piece of advice going forward. One specific question I have about what you just described is, I noticed that the colors were neutral, and I wonder why you just did neutral colors. And I don't remember what the survey said, but I think that well, maybe the survey said not to use bright and vibrant colors. I'm not sure, but so I guess my question is, you decided that neutral colors is the way to go, right?
Yes, that is
Okay.
correct.
Okay, all right. I have another question, but it's just slipped my mind. Darn.
I'll jump in then, Stephen.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and jump in and you think of your question.
Sure.
So Ladasha, I really like the aesthetic look of this. My question is, have you had an opportunity to do any, it's called customer discovery, to get an idea of who your audience is? So I know ultimately who your audience is as a college student, but I'm thinking that you're considering packaging this as a kit that would supplement other journals or academic calendars. Can you provide a little bit of information on that?
Sure. Can you actually repeat that question again?
Absolutely. So I know that ultimately you want to put this in the hands of college students or any student, but the middle person that would probably be buying this from you, I'm assuming, is a journal company or a planner company. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on where you would maybe sell this or how you would sell it, and is that correct on who you'd be selling it to?
Yes. So I thought about possibly it may be better to use a platform like Etsy, especially initially, just for, to gauge general student interest. I think that would be the first thing that I would do. Any specific company in mind? I don't really have that, but in general, I think I would go the Etsy route. Yes.
I think that's probably pretty smart, especially since Etsy has such a great reputation for really unique and handcrafted gifts. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Oh, yes.
And I agree with Stephen that I think getting a broader response would be really helpful. And also, doing a little bit of customer discovery, which is a little bit different than what you were doing. It's more, you are collecting data, but it is more interviewing, really, so that you can get to the answer. So I enjoyed it, and I'll be interested to follow you and to see what happens with this product. Stephen, did you think of your question?
Yes, it wasn't a very profound question. I was just curious as to how you found the machine. I mean, how did you find the machine? I've never seen a machine like that before.
Yeah, the machine. So it's called a Cricut machine, and the machine itself has different, like, for example, customization settings, like business cards, and you turn a dial on the machine to tell it what kind of thing you need it to cut.
Is that something you have access to at RIT?
No, this is a personal machine.
Huh.
And there's an app, and the Cricut also connects to your computer as well. There's a software that goes hand in hand. So the machine will connect to your phone app or your computer, and then you will choose specifically what kind of cut you want. So for example, you know, I chose the stickers, and you can do custom or note. They have specific automations that you can choose from, or you can do a custom cut.
So if you already own this machine, that gives added impetus to the idea that you're going to take this whole concept further after the semester is over, right?
Yes, exactly.
Great.
Right.
Okay. Well, lots of luck with that. It sounds like you're onto a good idea. I hope you've got to do a lot more work to get it going, but I think you've made an excellent start. And I'm glad.
Oh yes, absolutely.
I'm glad you used the project to get started in this way. So
yes, I definitely want to dive more into design and things like that.
if there are no more questions, it is, and we've gone 7 minutes over, so we should probably draw it to a close. Thank you very much, all three of you, for your excellent presentations. And we look forward to seeing you at the symposium. Meg?
Yeah, just fantastic job. And we're really proud of your efforts. And we know that you're balancing not just this and all the components that come with the Capstone project, but also your other classes. So great job. And we'll see you if you are in the United States. We'll see you the 25th. Nice job, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
We have somebody still on, Ernest Williams. So before we start to, oh, yeah, gone. Okay. So,
Hold up one second.